Thank you so much for joining. I'm Elizabeth Garlow. I'm a senior fellow with the New Practice Lab at New America. And last November, New America, in partnership with the Biden administration, hosted a gathering on policy design and implementation for equitable well-being. This was on the heels of a design sprint that we did with the Census Bureau and the Departments of Commerce and Treasury through an initiative called the Opportunity Project to develop tools that could help with the design and implementation of well-being measures. So throughout these gatherings and that sprint, we've cultivated this unlikely cross-section of policymakers, social and grassroots movement leaders across the US who are coming together to really deep dive on data, measurement, framework, and narrative building considerations to advance equitable well-being. So a group of participants, many of you are here today, have shared their interest in continued learning and exchange, and that is the purpose of our time together today. So as we open up, I'd like to ask two of my co-hosts to quickly introduce themselves, Tony Gadati and Amanda Janu. I'll turn it over to you, Tony.
My name is Tony Gadati, and I'm a JHD fellow at Harvard University's Edmund Lilly Safra Center for Ethics. The Just Health and Democracy Impact Initiative is a partnership between researchers, policymakers, and stakeholders working to deliver ethics-based, impactful, and timely solutions to urgent public problems. We're so glad to be with you and co-sponsoring this event because we know that meaningful prioritization of well-being and quality of life requires a whole-of-government approach to learning and policymaking. I look forward to hearing the discussions in today's webinar. Amanda, over to you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Amanda Janu, and I work as the Economics and Policy Lead for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, or We All, which is a global movement of actors who recognize that economic growth accompanied by worsening social and environmental outcomes really can't be considered success, but that turning things around is going to require us to change the way we think, the way we act, and really critically, the way we measure success. And a really important example in this movement is the Wellbeing Economy governments, who have all moved beyond GDP to develop holistic well-being frameworks and indicators that begin to evaluate their societal progress by their level of social and ecological well-being. And Canada's quality of life framework is one of my personal favorites, as they not only are measuring dimensions such as social connection and a sense of meaning and purpose, which especially this week we've heard is so critically urgent to begin looking more at within our own country here in the United States. But I'm just really excited that they'll be able to share a bit about their vision and learnings with our US government here as well. And I just want to also share for anybody who's interested in learning more about the Wellbeing Economy government's work. I'm going to post it in the chat. They're hosting a gathering next month in Iceland, where they're going to be diving into more discussions around well-being measurements, budgeting systems, and many other topics.
Thank you so much, Amanda. So welcome to all of you. We have an amazing core group of US federal policymakers, state and local policy leaders, and others who are really committed to well-being policy. And then we have these incredible colleagues in Canada who've been developing and spearheading early implementation of their quality of life framework, as Amanda just shared. So before we hear from them, I'd just like to turn it over to Rear Admiral Paul Reed, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Health at the US Department of Health and Human Services. Admiral Reed and his colleague Aaron McDonald and their team are spearheading the US Equitable Long-Term Recovery and Resilience Initiative, which is this incredible government-wide approach to improve well-being and long-term resilience in the US. So I'll turn it over to Admiral Reed.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And I'm just going to apologize up front for my voice, battling through a bit of laryngitis, but I am very happy to be here today, and I'm thrilled that this meeting is occurring, particularly at this point in time. I consider it a bit of non-randomness that we're having this convening because I see a convergence of a whole bunch of activities occurring, and to be able to be in conversation with our Canadian colleagues on the work that they have historically done and continue to do is just incredibly informative at this moment for us to consider moving forward in a number of different ways. From where I sit as the Director of the Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion within HHS, where we house our hallmark program, Healthy People 2030, and have housed it for over 40 years. I think speaking from that position and that perspective, we've seen a very natural evolution over 4 decades and then some in the way in which Healthy People entertains upstream factors, social determinants, and a broader perspective, a broader lens towards measuring health and now well-being. And we see that trajectory continuing into the next iteration. We're looking in the next couple of years to starting the process for developing Healthy People 2040. And part of that timeliness of this conversation is how this dialogue can be informative into the next steps of developing Healthy People 2040. That's just one of those convergences, as I mentioned. The other is, as Elizabeth mentioned, I've had the pleasure of being an executive shepherd, if you will, for the Equitable Long-Term and Recovery and Resilience Plan, which now has a 3-year history to it, born of the early stages of the pandemic response, when very difficult questions were asked of a cohort within the whole of government response framework around what the implications of the pandemic were going to mean for the federal government and for the whole of society, particularly entertaining a very complicated question, which is, what does the federal government need to do in the long term as we come through the pandemic response, through the recovery, and look to a long-term future in building out resilience for the nation, building to a higher level of resilience in this country than we knew in 2019? A very profound question with a lot of ramifications, not only for the federal government, but also for the way in which the federal government interacts with the whole of society. And we've been doing a great deal of work in that space, as Elizabeth alluded to, and as Aaron will speak to a bit, I think, as well in our conversations later this hour. We believe the framework that the Canadians have developed and are utilizing ought to be very informative into that process as well. And we believe also, I'll speak for myself, I firmly believe that the work we're doing to develop a measurement strategy around resilience and all of its components is also going to be complementary to the next iteration of Healthy People 2030 or 2040, excuse me, and the way in which we look to expand on well-being as a concept and a measurement strategy around that as well. So with those remarks, I'll be quiet. My voice is probably going to force me to be anyway, and I'm going to get out of the way of great conversation. But I very much appreciate everybody being here, especially to hear from our Canadian colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Admiral Reed. And we heard you loud and clear, even through the laryngitis. So thank you for that. So I'm excited to turn it over to our colleagues in Canada, who will share for about 20 minutes some background on their work with the Quality of Life Framework. And then we'll turn it over to Aaron McDonald within HHS and the lead on the Equitable Long-Term Recovery and Resilience Plan to share some questions with our guests. So Harry Wolansky, I will start with you first. If you could please introduce yourself and then share some of your presentation, we would be delighted. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the introduction. So delighted to be here to hear about the momentum that's coalescing together in different sort of parts of society. So not just within government, but civil society and all of that. I think that really mirrors our experience here in Canada. My name is Carrie Wolansky. I come to you with 2 hats to talk about one of my very favorite topics, which is the story of origin of Canada's Quality of Life Framework. I have 2 hats because at the beginning of the development of Canada's Quality of Life Framework, I was the director responsible from a policy standpoint of that work in the Department of Finance, so tied into the budget process. I've now moved to Statistics Canada, which is responsible for the program of quality of life statistics. So very much keen on taking this work to that sort of next level. So I'm going to be talking to you from both of those hats because a lot of your questions have talked about sort of how did we get here. So I'm going to start with almost my kind of finance voice and then shift into Statistics Canada. So if you wouldn't mind displaying the slides, we can go straight to the second one. So in distilling the international conversation in this space, there's such a clear convergence of the momentum around these 3 things, these 3 thematic areas. So people call it different things, could be quality of life, could be well-being, could be the social determinants of health, could be the multidimensional aspects of poverty. There are different ways into this conversation, but the core idea there is we need to be multidimensional and holistic and look at how the pieces fit together in terms of social, economic, and environmental considerations. So that's sort of a thematic lens. But there's also this issue of equality, distributions, differences in outcomes for different groups and how you reflect that that story. And then there's the issue of sustainability and resilience. So what does this all look like in terms of the trajectory and pathway we're on? What are the implications of our decisions today? What are the long-term impacts and considerations? And sometimes sustainability gets wrapped into a conversation about climate change, which is obviously fundamentally important to the conversation about sustainability. But our frame for sustainability is broader than that. It's also about a life course approach to, education and learning. It's about prevention and health and that sort of thing. So next slide, please. So this is, I referred to this a moment ago, our process steps in our story of origin. We had direction from the Prime Minister to the Minister for Middle Class Prosperity and Associate Minister of Finance at the time in his mandate letter at the beginning of the 2019 mandate to lead work directly referencing work internationally by New Zealand and Scotland on integrating quality of life measurements better into the budgeting and policy development process. And so we'll talk a bit more about the process of how we got to the release in Budget 2021 of our framework and our approach to implementing in the budget process. In the next mandate in 2021, the Minister for Middle Class Prosperity became the president of the Treasury Board, and this work came with her. So my colleague Stephanie will talk about the role that the Treasury Board that supports her now plays in the implementation and leadership of this work government-wide. But interestingly, the mandate letters which go from the Prime Minister, all ministers in the cabinet, all include this reference to integrating quality of life considerations into their decision-making processes. So it's no longer just the responsibility of one minister, it's the responsibility of all ministers in cabinet to think about this alongside a practice. We have the longstanding practice to think about gender-based analysis plus, the plus being a broad range of other diversity considerations. And then with my StatCan hat, we launched our Quality of Life Hub in March 2022, which is the sort of public-facing mechanism by which we bring together the measurement of the indicators in the framework that was launched in Budget 2021. So next slide, please. Here it is. This is our framework. There's a lot going on here, but let me tell you about the architecture, which is actually deceptively simple. We worked hard to do the hard work to keep things simple. So it's got these 5 domains. And if you think back to the 1, 2, 3 in that first slide, the 5 domains are our way of trying to get at the multidimensional aspects of well-being. So prosperity, which includes housing, health, poverty, that sort of thing. Health, which includes mental health, as well as the care system and a positive mental health frame, importantly. Society, which includes things like relationships to your community, to friends and family, time use, that sort of thing. Environment, which includes the air quality and water quality. So how is your environment impacting humans, but also things like conservation and climate change. And is our environment healthy to keep sustaining us? And then good governance, which has, for example, trust in institutions, crime and safety, discrimination, human rights, that sort of thing. So we have the 5 domains of our framework. And then if you think again back to that 1, 2, 3, we have these 2 cross-cutting lenses. So if that was 1, the domains are 1 and they're supported by a set of 84 indicators. 2 is this cross-cutting lens on fairness and inclusion. So that is that gender-based analysis plus practice of looking at each of the indicators, not just as a national average, but as a distributional picture. So what's happening underneath that? Are groups falling behind, et cetera. Then we also have a cross-cutting sustainability and resilience lens. And that one is meant to get at that long-term dimensions. And I'll be really interested, to be honest, to hear where your work goes on resilience. I think our framework is probably in its infancy on that element. It's there, people are asked to think about it in their work. It's not fully developed. Next slide, please. So in terms of the development of the framework, you had mentioned your intersectoral collaboration. That was and the whole of government focus, very relevant for us as well. We had an interdepartmental group, the Deputy Minister of Finance tasked his colleagues to form an Assistant Deputy Minister group that met quite regularly through the period of development of the framework. And the idea there was to make sure that we were reflecting the existing frameworks that already were there, the key indicators the departments were already working towards, that sort of thing, as well as the subject matter expertise being fairly broad. So one of the things we kicked off with was a mapping exercise where we looked at all the other frameworks. So for example, the Canadian indicator for the framework for the Sustainable Development Goals, which indicators were they tracking? And we tried to simplify and distill the multitude of frameworks that exist across the government into these sort of overarching themes that were underpinned by this evidence base globally on life satisfaction evaluations. Canada is highly federated, and unlike any work I've been involved in, frankly, as part of the federal government before, this framework goes much beyond our the scope of our responsibilities. So we did not limit it. We used that global evidence base to anchor us in what we thought we should be measuring, rather than starting from what we were doing and proving it was working. And so that is a feature that's new, and it makes this kind of a monitoring framework versus, for example, you could set targets off the back of your monitoring, but there's not targets and activities clustered against each of these indicators. We're monitoring things that government may have little to do with in order to see how Canadians are doing. Also important in the Canadian context, we're in the process of renegotiating around the Crown Indigenous relations and also reconciliation. And so we had conversations with national Indigenous organizations, many of whom have longstanding wisdom to offer in terms of holistic thinking, asset-based framing, and sustainability and long-term thinking. You don't see it reflected right now in the framework architecture because our decision to support what they were saying was to invest in Indigenous-led framework development and data sovereignty. So there's investments that came at Budget 2021 in Indigenous data governance. I do hope that over time that this work will sort of cross-pollinate again, and we have sort of bookmarked that the framework remains evergreen to allow for that to happen. I mentioned the evidence base, so I won't go into that again, just to say that we did talk to, it was COVID times, we talked to so many experts in this space. We're so grateful for their contributions, and it was surprising the extent to which even traditional economic stakeholders were along for the ride. And there was sort of a focus on addressing data gaps, this distributional considerations, the long-term perspective that you see represented in the framework. Next slide, please. I want to spend a second here because you asked about this idea of ground truthing. That's new language for me, but we did do this interesting exercise on public opinion research. And this was in August 2020. So it was early in the pandemic, people were still home and largely, it was really interesting. It was one of the most interesting public opinion research panels the public opinion researchers had ever done because people were so reflective at that time about what was changing and what it meant for them, and really sort of back to basic truth and principles about what matters. So these really basic things: physical health, financial security, mental health, personal safety, and there was a broad support for thinking about government moving beyond GDP. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to briefly switch over to my StatCan hat. Say we launched this hub. I'd love for you to check it out. I'll make sure somehow, I haven't figured out the mechanism, but I'll make sure you have a link to it so that you can go and explore what's there. It's still a work in progress. It will always be, but what it does is it provides the data that we have. So it pulls together from across Statistics Canada and other data providers, all of the supporting data and evidence underneath each of those indicators and related research so that you can access it in sort of a one-stop place. We want to work on its functionality, that sort of thing. But what it's giving you is, you can go there and get the most recent data that's available on any of those indicators. We also have a program to actively look at data gaps and filling data gaps. And so that could be gaps where we've collected something, so we don't collect something at all. It could be gaps where we collect something, but it's every 5 years. So timeliness is the issue. Could be gaps where we collect something, but it's not disaggregatable in the way that we'd like to see in terms of the subpopulation differences. Or it could be that it's collected, but just not published. So we've been addressing all of those, piece by piece. That's our work program. So next slide, please. I want to point to this. We're nearly done, but I want to point to this as an example of a data gap that we've filled. This is based on the UK's measure of sense of meaning and purpose. We adopted their measure. We think that international standardization is really valuable to build traction and consensus around these indicators. And so this is data that was never collected in Canada before, the quality of life framework. And so it tells you about the distribution regionally of sense of meaning and purpose. And there's a age split here, age and gender split that I think is interesting. On the bottom, you can see the lower levels of sense and meaning purpose around younger men than women, for example. So, not declaring on what should happen or if anything as a result of that, but it's just an interesting example of the sorts of signals you can see from this monitoring work. So last slide, I just want to take a moment to talk about, this is sort of what we're seeing. One indicator, so it's not going to be a surprise to anybody that people are feeling the pinch of inflation. This is a conversation everyone's well familiar with. But I think to make the point about objective and subjective indicators and how they can complement one another, if you look at inflation trends, the growth in inflation starts to slow at the same time as people start to report having more and more difficulty paying their bills. So if you look at these three lines, the red line is people who are finding it easy to pay their bills. And you can see that big dip in that last quarter, which is Q4 of 2022. So the winter, last winter, you can see that big drop. So you can see it trending down and then it dropping. And then conversely, the blue line is, sorry, I got that backwards. Red is the easy or very easy, and that's coming down, and very difficult is the blue, and it's coming up. So more people are finding it much harder. You can see that crossover effect. So that's just an example of why it's interesting and relevant to monitor how people are experiencing this economic trend versus just the economic trend itself. Because that's the same time when people started to talk about the rate of growth slowing and things effectively getting better. So I'm going to wrap there and hand over to my colleague, Stephanie.
Hello, so my name is Stephanie Gann, and I'm a director of a team called Frameworks Integration. It's my team then that oversees the implementation of quality of life. The aim is to get it across the decision-making cycle, but we'll talk about that in some detail in just a moment. It is that Carrie, with her two hats, is able to cover off kind of two aspects of the journey. The one that I will focus on is about how to make it so that this framework is understood for what it can do with the tools that we have where I am in the Charter Board Secretariat. So could I ask for my deck to be projected, if that's possible? Thank you very much. So let's go to slide 2, actually. So we understood that once you have the framework, the quality of life data in mind, what you naturally will progress to in terms of topics of interest is, how is it going? And our story is one about implementation and kind of what it is taking and what it will take to have what everyone is interested in, which is the impacts, the actual positive impacts on quality of life. And for us, that means the well-being and quality of life of Canadians. Next slide, please. So this might be a curious place to start, although it might be something that's not too unfamiliar to kind of the policy practitioners. When we talk implementation in government, an essential piece of that is looking at the kind of supporting infrastructure, the nuts and bolts, the inside plumbing for how decision making happens. You can't just have a direct impact on outcomes without thinking through how it is that decisions are made and how you get there. And so here, what you have is the decision-making process as we see it. The ambition is to see it so that the quality of life framework, the data and the approach is actually applied at every one of these steps. So where do we start? It's with the agenda that the government sets and the priorities that they identify. There are a number of different mechanisms by which this occurs. And so you have some that are listed here. For instance, the government will kick off every new session of Parliament with a speech from the throne. There are mandate letters that Kerry referred to, which is how the Prime Minister communicates specific commitments and expectations to his or her cabinet ministers. It's with that agenda then that the Minister of Finance identifies budget priorities based on input from all ministers. This is an important piece of the quality of life puzzle in that, yes, as much as we at the Treasury Board Secretariat are responsible for implementing quality of life, it was by virtue of the mandate letters that this responsibility was clarified to be that of all ministers. It is just here at TBS that we need to be supporting them in their duties. So what we'll get to in just a moment is about how quality of life is reflected in the budget process. Once you have your budget priorities, there is a step of going to cabinet for discussions and for outstanding policy authorities. It's from there that there's a little bit of a handoff to my department. It's that as a TBS, we are secretariat to the executive cabinet committee known as Treasury Board. It has a particular role in vetting implementation proposals of things that have funding, things that have policy authorities. It's here that we have a number of levers to make things happen before things hit the ground running with ministers and departments rolling out policies in implementation and monitoring and evaluating them. So that is the overview of kind of the steps where we hope to integrate quality of life into the process. But there's something about how introducing new initiatives, new ways of thinking, even if they make sense, how it really just cannot be done all at once. There are hats, there are leads, and there's the importance of coordinating. So I think in this space, even from the government perspective, where you're supposed to be, the strong suit is planning, and making plans to plan. But there's a patchiness to it, I think, of introducing new things, even if they matter, even if they can make a difference. So there's a little bit of a story of that we'll look at a little bit more. Can I get to the next slide, please? So what you would have seen in the decision-making process is a number of steps that have the central agencies or government having shared having some responsibility for. So that's the Privy Council office that oversees the cabinet process. It's the department that supports the Prime Minister. They are a very important partner for us. It is really, though, kind of finances efforts in implementing quality of life and our efforts as TBS that will be the focus here. But it is that you'll see that in different jurisdictions, there normally is the appreciation for how quality of life as a policy lead needs to reside centrally. There are some things you give up when you house it somewhere different, in health, let's say, or in a social department where, let's say, the work on well-being is significantly more advanced. You really do give up some levers, but that is the choice that you can make. There are sometimes decisions to house the lead in a version of the PCO. As you will have heard, and as we'll talk about more in the next slide, can make the choice of putting it in the Treasury or a Department of Finance. That creates a certain, thank you very much for that, that creates a certain foundation and puts you on a certain path. I don't think there's consensus over what is the best choice. There has to be some appreciation for where a particular jurisdiction is at and what levers are available. Side note, that we have a Treasury Board Secretariat is a bit weird to lots of partners, and that's something that that has advantages and disadvantages. But more concretely, when we're talking about quality of life implementation then, and in budgeting, which is where we kicked it off under Carrie's work. In fact, what we're talking about is in the course of identifying budget priorities. Normally it's the case that the Minister of Finance will actually have a call out for budget requests from the rest of cabinet ministers. And there's a very well-defined process for this and a very particular form that proposals for budget measures takes. And this becomes really quite important in holding the purse strings. The Department of Finance is able to set a certain standard for the kind of information required for budget measures. And since 2021, this has included the identification of expected impacts on quality of life indicators. This means that at the development of these measures, this is something that has to be thought about and considered with some conscientiousness. So it is that since Budget 2021, budgets have been published with an impacts report that summarizes these impacts on a measure by measure basis. Now, this ends up being very important for TBS. Next slide, please. So it was in late 2021 that the handoff process happened. So it was now that quality of life was in the budgeting process. How do we roll it out more generally? So it's that if we go back, so not actually go back in the deck, but if you can remember in the decision-making process, when we're at implementation, this is where actually TBS has quite a significant role. It is that as in providing support to Treasury Board, again, that statutory cabinet committee, it has a function as the government's management board and ensures that implementation plans of things that are funded and have appropriate policy cover are consistent with the government's TB policy suite, one of which is the policy on results. So at TBS, it's that in this capacity, we have a number of tools to establish expected outcomes for deputy ministers, expectations for management practices and policies for new program designs, but also for the existing spending base. And this is pretty important for the kind of change that we want to see in incorporating quality of life into government work. So these implementation proposals that end up being presented to the Treasury Board, well, we are wanting, these proposals have a number of components that are required, including details on program design, implementation costs, but also expected results. Importantly, funds approved through budget just cannot be accessed without approval of the Treasury Board, and that is a lever that we use and intend to use with a little bit more vigor. Going ahead, we are looking at the better integration of quality of life data into these proposals, consideration of the framework in plans for evaluation and performance measurement, alignment of government program outcomes with quality of life indicators. I would say that TBS also has a very important role in government-wide reporting. federal departments prepare an annual plan, annual reports rather, on their plans and results achieved. And the president of the Treasury Board tables these reports in Parliament. It's that the TBS develops requirements for these plans and guidance for how to meet them. And on the reporting front, we're looking at options for how to introduce something like a common reporting frame on quality of life that can help shape departmental narratives in the interest of clarity and transparency to Canadians and parliamentarians on what we're doing on quality of life. Because in fact, that's where—
a couple more minutes, just a couple more minutes, and then we'll turn to questions. Thank you.
Sorry, I will try to wrap that up then. So next slide, please. So I think maybe I'll tie it up together by saying it is in, it might feel as though TBS in the role of implementation might feel as though it's inside baseball, but it is that if you don't get some of these processes and steps in place, you're kind of shooting darts in the dark. What matters here is the results at the end. That is how the approach survives. That's how you show that it has value. But on the way there are a number of things that have to come into play. There's a tremendous amount of coordination, as I mentioned, among central agencies, but also with the departmental community as well. Quality of life did not show up on the scene, kind of blank slate. There was a lot that was going on previously that was quite well aligned with well-being work. And it's really important that we acknowledge this to be able to have the partners to move ahead together. None of what we're proposing here is trivial. It's not a checklist, and it actually requires building some foundational blocks, including capacity and training, and perhaps recruiting differently for the kind of perspectives we want to see reflected in policy work going ahead. Carrie had mentioned how the quality of life framework is not just about levers and outcomes that the federal government controls. And for that reason, our engagement with the outside community is extremely important, to say nothing of how it is that all this work is premised on this idea that Canadians see themselves in their framework, agree and support that we have identified the things that matter. And for the fact that the work in the framework is evergreen means that exchange and of information and feedback is, I think, a crucial piece. So to tie it all up, maybe I would say that engagement opportunities like this are very important for us to be able to learn from other jurisdictions and also other sectors as well. Thank you for the flex on time.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. There is so much to share. I think that's always the challenge of an hour of conversation, but a first step in that, and we'll unpack a little bit. So thanks to you and Carrie for sharing just the big frame and all of the kind of pieces. I think we're going to spend a couple minutes kind of pulling apart. I have a couple of questions for you both just to reflect on that align with what you shared and maybe go a little bit deeper into a couple aspects. I'll mention I know that we've seen some questions pop through in the Q&A in the chat, so keep them coming. And I'm going to include some of the questions that have been shared into what I'm offering to both of our colleagues to reflect on, because they were aligned with what's on our minds as well as we went into the conversation. So I think first, one of the things that and I know I personally have been really curious about is why quality of life as the kind of centerpiece or the North Star or the core of the focus for the framework? And was there any deliberation in terms of how you really oriented towards that as the centerpiece? And were there other kind of directions that were in play as you developed the approach?
So yes, there were. And I mean, this is part of the challenge. I call this the Hall of Mirrors. So while there have been a lot of people active in this space, it's often, say, the Department of Health, which is essentially creating a framework which points up to health as the ultimate outcome. Or it's the Department of Finance that's saying, yeah, quality of life is well and good, but it's really about prosperity at the center of things. And so there's a lot of alignment in the kind of horizontal thinking, but when you get to that sort of what are we driving towards, what's the big picture, that was a bit trickier. So we did have lots of negotiations, and it's never going to be completely done, but our sort of idea was that this was, you don't even though poverty is an important determinant of health, you don't fix poverty solely to achieve a health outcome. Poverty is its own determinant of well-being. And so there's continues to be an active dialogue in this space. But in terms of quality of life versus, say, well-being, we actually did public opinion research on that question too. Quality of life came out ahead. Another sort of framing thing that is a bit of a tension is this just another name for social, as distinct from environment and economic? And you can see in our framework that that's not where we landed. This quality of life framework brings in the environment and economy in a sort of a different way that's more integrative, in my opinion. So that was kind of a bit of a synopsis of many discussions.
Super helpful. Stephanie, do you want to add anything or?
Sure. So it was that we were a little bit less implicated in those discussions that landed the framework, but in the course of pursuing implementation, I think what we find is maybe I would say a couple things. The first is that by keeping the door open to the fact that it is evergreen, I think there is this tension as we're rolling out internally. Is it where we want it to be? But in terms as a starting point, it's that we have quality of life, so we're sticking to it for now. But it is that for the other departments that are grounded in the work that they are pursuing, they are proposing other centers, let's say, or it's that you have the framework, but you could have different centers. So let's say they would advocate for a certain center. To say nothing of how I think in the environmental or sustainability space, there is an expansion of it that in some circles would be seen as like rivaling what the quality of life framework is supposed to capture, which is essentially everything at a certain societal level. So it's that I think you will have this tension between competing frameworks, competing visions of the world. It's kind of part and parcel the exercise, even if you think you've landed something for a little bit.
That's great. Yeah, I think we face the same tension, but I think where we've come to at least now is how do we help folks from very different points of view see themselves in different frames, even if they have one orientation, and understand it's all related in terms of the intersections that you're both pointing out. So I wanted to ask, I know this is a much deeper question than we can get to, but any insights on how you approach kind of moving from big ideas or concepts to more operational qualities of measurement? All of the things that are in the framework that you have, I think, are really important big ideas. And then, the quality of how do you make that concrete in a way that's not burdensome and also feels like it's really orienting to a core set of measures to be helpful in advancing that idea. So I'm curious if you have any insights about how you approach that.
I think the mapping exercise that we did was sort of a bottom-up version of that. So what are we already measuring that matters? But then there's sort of a top-down approach too, where you start from, what is the big picture? What's our North Star? What does the evidence say about what we know matters? And I think both of those things coming together is important because we included some things in our framework that we didn't have existing measures for. Also mapping the international landscape matters too, as I mentioned in that one example that I provided. But yeah, I think there's sort of you want to come at it from different perspectives and try to sort of articulate where you want to be. And then once you've got a shape to things, then so we included measures in our frameworks that didn't exist. And I think that's important because then we put in our next steps list. Okay, we have to go and figure it out now to measure that thing. And so it was a sort of a separate step to say, what do we think is important to have in the framework? And then how are we going to measure it? What's the definition? And so that work has been led by Statistics Canada versus the conceptual framing led by finance.
Great. Okay.
I do think the finance and stats can work was the heavy lifting and the very first foundational step to get to anywhere. In our implementation work, this is, I think, the first discussion that we have to get out of the way of, what is quality of life? That's really nebulous. It can mean anything. And our answer is no, we have a framework. There are 84 things we're saying it can mean for now. Yes, we might not have data sources for just about or for all of them, but we're just about there. But just having identified the indicators, of course, is not the end of the project. That's where we're supposed to be helpful. So it's that we are, as TBS, in the business of making the concept real. So I had mentioned, or maybe not, in that my title is very long, my division is results division in TBS. It needs to go from concept to actual result. But it could be that you're looking at, I guess, different kinds of operationalization. There is one way in which, oh yes, just moving the needle on the indicators is what you are looking for. But for us, in the machinery of government, we look at government initiatives on an initiative basis, and for each, they are supposed to be able to say what they will do for Canadians, and to be able to draw that link to the quality of life framework. So maybe that's a good plug for Hal. As much as TBS provides the supports to be able to make that happen, the expertise is not, the policy expertise is not here. The departments tell us how that's possible, what makes sense, what logic models make sense. We can only support them in that effort.
That's great. Yeah. That also, so that relates to, a question I know I'm seeing coming from the audience as well. And Stephanie, you use this language in your remarks about Canadians seeing themselves in the frame, or those qualities of what the work is. And I'm curious if you can share, I know you were both speaking to the robust process of how you engaged and got feedback and real, work to begin dialogue, but I'm hoping you can speak to what the level of awareness and active engagement is in terms of the quality of life framework, or what you're hoping to see that evolve to for kind of the normal folks, or the folks across the country, in terms of their ownership or just their awareness of how that framework is connected to the resources or policies that are advancing from the government.
Carrie, I'll start if that's okay. It's a very interesting question. Something that I didn't manage to get out of my presentation is how, in some ways, the quality of life file is very unusual for TBS. We are not normally this outside facing. We deal with the government and supporting the rest of government. And so I think this question is one that we maybe are still reflecting on, in that we want the results, we want the outcomes. It is almost maybe this is sacrilegious to those who are closer to the well-being work, but if it doesn't, if it's not recognized as the fruits of the quality of life approach, that could be okay. It is just that I think, in our view, the socialization of the quality of life framework is an important piece to making sure it stays around and sets expectations so that the public, demand that the quality of life outcomes. But you could end up in a place where the outcomes are achieved without everyone knowing about the framework.
Yeah, I agree with that. Great point. Carrie, anything to add?
Yeah, I think this work has an element of participatory democracy. And people come to it from a lot of different channels. And so we had a lot of these conversations early on, and people were starting from, sometimes they're starting from a population group that of interest. Sometimes they're starting from a thematic area or what have you. And so there was, hundreds of conversations with people sort of having a slightly different version of their starting point. And so I think I saw Chris Barrington-Lee here. So I'll give a shout out to work that he's been instrumental in leading, which is kind of coalescing a community of practice outside of government, of people, academics, well, actually government and outside of government. So similar to the structure I think that you're building here, that brings people into the same conversation with each other. And I think that's a really valuable contribution, that it's, people were having individual conversations with government, but it's really valuable for them to be talking together as well, and moving to sort of, identify there's going to be some differences, but also some shared areas of focus. And that's really valuable to us if we can sort of coalesce around that.
Amazing. Thank you both. I know, given time, I'm going to hand back to Elizabeth, but just to say, really appreciate your insights and reflections on that, and a lot more to learn as we go forward.
Thank you so much. Incredible nuts and bolts. There's so much that we could dig into here. And there were a number of questions that were coming up too about just kind of more granular level detail on the quality of measurement, the sort of, the undergirding questions or data points within your 5 domains. And so I do want to remind the audience that we dropped a link to the Quality of Life Hub. When I first landed on this hub, I was totally blown away by how much you all have put forth as available to the public. And so I just want to thank you so much for that. And thank you for giving us some of the behind the scenes kind of deliberations and things that helped really inform the development of all that. To close us out, I'm going to turn to 3 US federal colleagues to just kind of quickly share some of the insights, what struck them within the context of the work that they're currently doing as part of this exchange. So I'm going to turn first to Shannon, then to Sunil, and then to Danielle. So if you could quickly introduce yourself and share just a couple minutes to help close us out. Thank you.
Sure. I'm Dr. Shannon Aravisu. I'm a sociologist, and I'm working as a senior advisor within the Office of the Chief Data Officer at the Department of Commerce. And one of the things that really struck me about your work is the fact that you have created a North Star for your country, and that you started from first principles around what are the factors that contribute to national well-being, recognizing that there are many factors, not just government interventions and programs and policies that contribute to that well-being. And so the fact that you created that wide umbrella for so many different facets of society to fit into, I think is something that is going to be hugely instrumental for your success. And I'm also noticing attention to, change management principles and coalition building, and recognizing that this, to move this forward is going to require multiple sectors across society working together. And you provided a framework for businesses to fit in, for nonprofits to fit in. And I think that's really commendable and inspiring. I'm so excited to dig in more and also to see how we can evolve and adapt the current framework that Erin McDonald and her team is implementing at the moment. So I'll pass it over to the rest of my federal government colleagues.
Yes, thank you. So I'm Sunil Iyengar, Director of the Office of Research and Analysis, very much concerned with metrics and research at the National Endowment for the Arts. And I'm just loving this discussion. A resounding yes to everything Shannon said and Elizabeth have said in terms of praise of this framework. Just why it resonates for us, a quick minute. So the beyond the GDP framework, the NEA actually partners with the US Bureau of Economic Analysis to measure the arts contribution to GDP, as do a lot of countries, and I think Canada as well. But we too have for years tried to really understand some of these other benefits of the arts. And we've done that through a couple of things I want to mention. I'll just say that we actually worked with, have corresponded with our colleagues at Statistics Canada, because there's a convention coming up this summer, the Association of Cultural Economics International, where the first time they're actually including a well-being focus, health and well-being. So we've actually created a symposium to talk more about this work, arts and health and well-being and measurement specifically. But I liked what Carrie said about objective and subjective indicators flowing into each other, because let's just face it, we don't have a lot of hard data at this time, I would submit, in terms of randomized controlled trials and those kinds of studies on the arts' direct relationship and causality, in terms of causality to some of the subjective well-being measures, some of the health measures we constantly talk about. So that's why we're trying to support research with other federal partners like the National Institutes of Health on psychology, neuroscience, medical research, to support, to get more of that data that you can then point to. But I love the fact that the framework you've created, as is the Equitable Long-Term Recovery Resilience Framework, is aspirational and starting really with the theory and what the grounded theory of what these outcome areas are, and then going in and hopefully having some extant data, but creating new data where it doesn't exist. So I'll just quickly say in closing that 2 aspects of the arts, and I'd love to see the arts referenced more visibly in such frameworks. Creativity and self-expression, which is an outcome area which doesn't really, may slip between the cracks sometimes when we talk about intermediate outcomes of well-being. And of course, socialization. I know social exchange is a big part of your framework too. But our Surgeon General just released a report, advisory health advisory for the first time on isolation and the dangers of loneliness and isolation. And we think the arts have a big role to play. So we'll be working with the Equitable Long-Term Recovery Resilience Framework and hopefully do some more interagency working group efforts around arts, health, and civic infrastructure. Thank you so much.
And Sunil, it's the perfect segue because in order to get to those arts and cultural, you need public transportation. So Danielle Nelson, I work at the U.S. Department of Transportation, one of the 9 modes, the Federal Transit Administration. And I was just really pleased to see the quality of life framework, including under the environment sector, the walkable communities and access to public transit. And so we've been working very closely with our colleagues at Health and Human Services through what's called the Coordinated Council on Access and Mobility. It's a federal member council to improve human services transportation access. So just pleasant to be here today. And I know we're short on time, so we'll just stop there and pass it back over.
Thank you all so much. I think you really helped illustrate the breadth of learning that's possible through this kind of exchange. So thank you. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. We will follow up with a recording for your access. I know several folks were interested in that. And we also are going to share an invite to our next learning community call, which will be on June 20th. So with this learning community, what we're trying to do is sort of pop open the hood on state, local, and federal policy initiatives that are designed to foster equitable well-being. So please stay tuned for that. And thank you so much for being a part of today's conversation. Take care, everyone.